Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of December. Today we're doing a front update, primarily focusing on the Bakhmut, Zaporozhye, and Kherson fronts. Let's begin by looking at the region just to the west of Krymove, where the Russian forces have been advancing really throughout the 18th and 19th of December, mainly led by elements of the 98th Airborne Division. So the paratroopers from that unit, they have continued their advances to the south of Novomykhailivka. In terms of concrete territorial changes, you could see that they advanced through this field over here to the north of the rail line. So they are trying to take positions in these fields that are pretty close to Bodanivka, although they are not located on the heights yet. The heights that are to the south of Bodanivka, I've been talking about this for a while. They're located around the rail line over here. So the Ukrainians still hold on to those positions. And they have a new defensive line basically set up along this tree line over here, trying to prevent further Russian advances. Then a bit further south, you have the Russians continuing to clear out the fortification system, which is referred to as the Popivske Fortification system. In this region over here, they've now cleared out the large majority of the trenches and dugouts that were constructed by the Ukrainian forces over here. So in terms of the new Ukrainian positions, they're located around this cemetery area just to the west of it. And then looking further south, there was an advance over the past few days by the paratroopers where they were able to dismount from their BMD. So you have like 3 or 4 troops that are mounted on top of it. They get off, and then the BMDs and other infantry fighting vehicles, they provide fire support and try to suppress the Ukrainian positions, because most of the Ukrainian force in this region has already withdrawn to more favorable positions further west, but there is still a vanguard of Ukrainian forces that are holding a line to prevent a further Russian advance. And those are the troops that are engaging with the paratroopers when they make their way to the west of Krymove and are fighting in areas like this trench over here. And you can actually see part of that trench system on Google Maps, on satellite imagery. And then generally in the area around the car racing track, which is still considered a gray zone, but over the past few days, we've seen a Russian advance deeper and deeper into this area. And when I say this area, I mean the fields to the south of the T0506 road. Meanwhile, on Bakhmut's southern flank, we are also seeing Russian forces storming Ukrainian trench positions. And the force in this region that's leading these assaults is the 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment. And so we know that as of December 12th, they were actually able to get a foothold within this agricultural facility over here and some of the rural dachas. This was proven by a Ukrainian video posted by the 5th Assault Brigade, where they dropped grenades onto Russian forces in trenches that were built by the Ukrainians that are located in between the dachas that were then overrun by Russians. And so there was some back and forth going on in this region. And now we have confirmation based on 2 videos. The Russian forces have launched additional assaults, taking over more control over the dachas and really the agricultural fields in the southwesternmost corner of Bakhmut. So there's this one video which shows Russian infantry squads. They clear out the Ukrainian positions in the trenches and within the dachas as well. And you could also see the point of view of the FPVs during these assaults. So these FPVs, they were very important in targeting the Ukrainian forces that were serving as a vanguard in this region, still located within houses and within the basements of some of these houses. So that was the first step. And then from there, you saw the Russian forces advance. Let's actually measure it right now. About 1 kilometer at most, all the way to this region over here. So basically the southwesternmost corner of Bakhmut. And in this region, you had Russian dismounted infantry that cleared out the Ukrainian trenches and dugouts that were built in this region really throughout the course of the past year. Because if you are familiar with the Battle of Bakhmut, you know that the Russian forces never actually took over this agricultural facility. Even when the Wagner group was at its most successful point within the Battle of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians always held onto the fortifications over here. And so they did have a lot of time to lay out those defenses. And now the Russian forces have taken over most of this agricultural field. Some of the northern part is still a gray zone. And in a lot of these regions where you had the Ukrainian vanguard defending, you had the Russian forces supported by drones that were dropping grenades onto the dugouts and onto the trenches. And now looking at the bigger picture for a second, we see how the Russian vector of attack really lines up with heading in the direction of Ivanivske. We already see how the Russian forces have attacked just to the northeast of Ivanivske throughout this fortified system over here. And by doing so, the Russian forces are taking control over some key heights that overlook fields to the north of Ivanivske, but also overlook the valley that runs through Ivanivske itself, because again, Ivanivske is on a rather low elevation. At the same time, the Russian forces, as has been noted by pro-Ukrainian sources like Deep State, are putting pressure directly to the northeast of Ivanivske along this specific vector of attack. So in this particular instance, this vector of attack the Russians are advancing along is on really low elevation as well. So there's no height advantage gained through that, but it is additional pressure on some of the fortifications on the outskirts of the village. But then looking at the Russian advances to the southwest of Bakhmut around this red rectangle, those are actually located on heights that overlook the valley of Ivanivske. So there is this shaping of the battlefield by the Russian forces in this region to try to envelop Ivanivske from three sides and to gain control of key heights overlooking that village, which really does serve as really the strongest, most fortified defensive node of the Ukrainian forces located to the east of the Donbass Canal. Donbass Canal is over here, and then here you have Ivanivske, where you do have a rather large Ukrainian defensive component. Now, around December 18th and 19th, the Russian forces again continued expanding control over their foothold within height 215.7, which is this Ukrainian defensive fortification located to the northwest of Klishchiivka. It is the dominant height overlooking the valley within Klishchiivka. So that's the rationale behind the Russian advance. But it is surprising how the Russian forces were able to launch the attack from rather low elevation and push out the Ukrainian forces that were located on the height itself. And so at this point, much of the height is either under Russian control. As you can see on the map, you can see the Russian control over these trenches over here, which is backed up by geolocated footage, which was recently released, which shows Russian infantry squads entering into the trenches that were built on the perimeter of the height and clearing them out of any sort of Ukrainian presence. And then as for the rest of the system, it is likely a gray zone as the Ukrainian forces were forced to withdraw from areas that are rather near the Russian line of contact. At the same time, the Russian forces continue putting pressure onto the northern outskirts of Klishchiivka. They've been able to re-enter the tree lines located basically running parallel to the rail line north of Klishchiivka. So now I have a Russian presence along this rail line that was taken over by the Ukrainians in the fall when they ended up taking Klishchiivka. Now the Russian forces have counterattacked and have a presence within the Klishchiivka train station. And so as a result, the northernmost houses in the residential area of Klishchiivka are now considered a gray zone. And this is again backed up by mapping from the pro-Ukrainian side. Deep State maps, they have mapping that is extremely similar to this. And we also have the geolocated footage from the height itself. Around Marinka, there is a very minor territorial change to the map. So you had the Russian forces advance through this field over here, located just to the southwest of Marinka, taking over some of the bushy areas. And the Russian vector attack in this region does indicate the Russian forces trying to strengthen the flanks of their positions within Marinka, perhaps due to pushes along the T0532 road southwest towards Pobieda, but also perhaps to secure their flanks towards the attacks on the Ukrainian positions to the west of Marinka in the direction of Orikhiv. Meanwhile, looking at Novomykhailivka, we have this geolocated video, which I talked about in yesterday's video actually, which shows the Ukrainian Forces 79th Air Assault Brigade dropping grenades onto Russian forces that made their way into the fortifications built up by the Ukrainians on the southern outskirts of the village. And now we actually have the confirmation from Deep State Map that the Russian forces have a permanent presence within the cemetery over here, where again you did have Ukrainian defenses built, and around this agricultural facility. So you can see now that the Ukrainians no longer have a firm control over their defenses, and they really did build vast defenses to the south of Novomykhailivka, and now most of that area is a gray zone. At the same time, there are still some significant Ukrainian defensive components within the residential areas, but again, you can see how there are significant advances towards enveloping the village from especially the south, but also from the north and from the east, while within the village, you do still have firm Ukrainian control. Now, moving on to the Orikhiv sector, there is a pretty interesting phenomena that I haven't seen really reported on vastly by other sources, and that's in regards to the Ukrainian positions, not to the south of Robotyne around Novomykhailivka, because we have covered that pretty extensively over the past few weeks, but basically in the areas to the east of Robotyne, very close to the Surovikin line. We were talking about that extensively during the counteroffensive, but as focus shifted elsewhere, we really stopped talking about it as fighting really died down, as the Ukrainians lost their initiative in that region, and now we are seeing a gradual increase in Russian pressure in that same area. And so what I believe happened over the past few weeks is that you had Ukrainian forces on the Orikhiv sector decide to abandon some of their forward positions that are located very close to the Surovikin line. So previously, the front line in the Orikhiv sector around these open fields looked something like this. So you had Ukrainian forces several hundred meters away from the anti-tank ditch and from the Dragon's Teeth and Russian trenches that run along this part of the Surovikin line. In certain instances during the summer and fall, they were able to breach it, but since then the Russian forces solidified control and were actually able to push a bit further north through the fields. And now there's additional confirmation of Russian advance pretty deep into the fields that were previously taken over by the Ukrainians during their counteroffensive. And in the process of doing so, the Russian forces actually entered this local height. And so this is backed up by a video which shows Ukrainian 33rd Brigade, their FPV hit a Russian soldier directly. And then there's also presence of other Russian soldiers along this same path. And so the reason why the Ukrainians would withdraw from this region is because going into the winter season, a lot of their defenses in this region would be rather tenuous and exposed to Russian firepower. So really the Ukrainian vanguard that would now have lost the initiative and would be on a defensive footing, they would be defending in open fields and in tree lines that are very exposed to the Russian positions that are located in much more fortified areas and located on heights that are overlooking some of the Ukrainian defenses in the valley located over here and located over here. And another issue is the fact that with these tree lines, they've lost a lot of foliage due to the winter season, but also due to the heavy fighting in the region. So there's much less concealment for any sort of forward Ukrainian troops that are located in a dugout or in a trench that was dug up in this region. So it's my opinion that the Ukrainians actually made the decision to basically abandon positions and basically set up camp several kilometers north in some more well-defended positions in trenches that were built up by the Russian side directly to the east of Verboltenie. And the reason why I'd say that the Russian forces didn't simply force them at gunpoint to retreat from this area and kick them out is really because we haven't seen many videos from the sector to the east of Verboltenie that indicate that there was extremely heavy fighting. So it seems like this happened at a time when the fighting more or less died down, but now we're actually seeing the Russian forces take advantage of this Ukrainian withdrawal and taking up positions in those newly abandoned Ukrainian positions. We could also see this in the area to the west of Verbove, where during the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian troops tried to take control over the Surovikin line, the Dragon's Teeth and anti-tank ditch located over here, which they were successful in doing. And then they gained a foothold within this manned trench. And then from there, they were unable to establish a permanent presence within Verbove. Now, they have abandoned some of their positions, and the Russian forces are retaking some areas like open fields and tree lines and advancing along the anti-tank ditch and along the manned trench. They were able to advance a couple hundred meters over the past few days. There's actually an advance of around 700, 800 meters from the 76th VDV division. And so this is backed up by this geolocated video, which shows the Ukrainians' 82nd Air Assault Brigade, and specifically their FPV drone unit, the Wild Division, striking the troops of that paratrooper division as they were walking through a path trying to advance along a local road to retake some of the abandoned Ukrainian positions. And there was one strike specifically on a Russian troop accumulation that was mounted on a BMD-2. So that gives an idea of the recent Russian advances in this region. And in terms of the Ukrainian units that are defending the most in this region, as we talked about, you have the 33rd Mechanized Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. You have further west, the 65th Mechanized Brigade defending on the Verboltenie sector. And then you also have the 3rd National Guard Brigade Spartan. I've seen them defending further east and further west, but they're also located generally in the sector. Something interesting that happened is that you have the 46th Air Assault Brigade, one of the Ukrainian units that was slated for the counteroffensive. They've now been moved to defend against the Russian advances around Marinka. So they're no longer participating in the engagements on the Orikhiv sector. Now moving on to the Krynky bridgehead, we're going to take a deeper dive into the situation around here. In recent days, the Russian forces have really increased their amount of firepower, shelling airstrikes on the Ukrainian positions in and around the village of Krynky itself. So for instance, we have this video over here, which shows a rather large barrage of Russian TOS-1A shelling of the Ukrainian forward line in Krynky, which helped us clarify where the actual front line is. So this area, which is like the easternmost part of Krynky, This is likely a gray zone at the moment. No side really has solid control over there. So the Ukrainian concentration is really in the center of the village. The Russian forces are, as I said before, launching heavy strikes on troop accumulations in the houses of Krynky, but also further north. You did have Su-34 bombers dropping Fab 1500s in batches of 2, basically. And they're dropping them on the Ukrainian troops that are landing, first of all, across the Dnieper River. Also on the supply lines that are leading towards Krynky. You have several pads that were mapped out by the Ukrainian side, the Marines that landed and try to make their way to Krynky. And, they're sending basic supplies, ammo, and then also supplies that are needed for the survival of any sort of infantryman. And so those logistical processes are very difficult when you have this significant amount of Russian strikes on the rear and also on the front line. And when we're talking about the rear, we could look at some of the staging points for the Ukrainian Marines. They're also being struck, and recently we have this video over here of Su-34 bombers, again, dropping Fab 1500, which struck a Ukrainian staging point, which is near this grain elevator. And that was basically an area where the Marines would set up their speedboats and then cross the river and land on the bridgehead. So you see some pretty significant strikes on those areas even before they begin their operations on the bridgehead. Now, the Fab 1500s are particularly dangerous because they have a 675 kilogram explosive yield, and that is actually enhanced by the UMPK glide and guidance kits, which they have attached to them. And although they aren't extremely precise, this is sort of offset by the fact that those bombs really have a large explosive radius and cause a lot of damage. At the same time, over the past few weeks, the Russian forces have increased their utilization of drones on this bridgehead, targeting, again, a lot of houses in the region. And then they have not FPVs, but actually just drones dropping grenades onto speedboats and onto landing positions for Ukrainian Marines as they make their way towards Krynky itself. And so a combination of all these firepower factors is a big reason for why the several hundred Marines that are located across the river are experiencing very heavy casualties. And again, the logistical situation is only further complicating that. A lot of this is backed up by a recent article written by the Kiev Independent, where they interviewed Ukrainian soldiers that were involved in the operations on the sector, talking about their experiences within the Krynky bridgehead. And one of the biggest complaints that they had is in regards to the lack of sufficient long-range artillery, mainly in order to break up Russian troop concentrations and silence their own artillery guns. The Russian forces are firing towards the village of Krynky. And then another big complaint is in regards to a lack of sufficient air defense systems to fight against the Russian Air Force and their strikes that are occurring on a very regular basis, because the Russian forces are actually spending a lot of their air sorties. A lot of them are being directed towards the Krynky bridgehead into the Kherson front in general. Actually, it could be a majority at this point. And so the air defense system is especially important in trying to quell those strikes to reduce the amount of damage incurred by the Ukrainian Marines, especially at a close range. Another key issue mentioned is in regards to the unit involved. One of the units spearheading the operation is the 35th Marine Brigade. They were fighting throughout the counteroffensive for months. And again, they were fighting in one of the hottest parts of the front line, Oruzhenie, Stromayorsk, that entire region. And so they experienced, a lot of attrition during that time, of course. They did have some success, but then upon being rotated out of the front line, they only had a couple of weeks of rest before being moved to the operations across the Dnieper River. And so there is a lot of exhaustion and fatigue for those soldiers who have not had that much time to rest and recuperate and rebuild their forces, restockpile on equipment, and so on. And then really last thing that I'm going to mention is in regards to Ukraine's Birds of Magyar FPV drone unit, which has been one of their, or probably the most effective drone unit they've used since the beginning of the war, targeting a lot of Russian troop concentrations and vehicles across the Dnieper River. A lot of them actually on this highway over here that leads into Krynky. So they have had success in the past few months in regards to those strikes. Recently, they've had an issue which was reported by the head of that unit, where they mentioned that a lot of their recent orders of FPV drones, specifically the Mavic 3 Pros that were ordered by them on December 13th, are actually not able to make it through into Ukraine and towards the front line because of a current blockade that is being imposed by Polish truckers on border crossings into Ukraine. And so that's causing an issue at the moment because they're urgently needed by this unit. And so the unit is looking for locally produced drones that were made within Ukraine that could be sent to the front line. And at the same time, in the same post, this unit acknowledged that the Russian forces have improved their electronic warfare systems in recent weeks to counter the threat posed by their drone arsenal. And so that's really all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.